You're listening to A Slice of Therapy with me, Alun Parry. Now, last summer, I think it was, I took part in a half marathon race. Now, by saying I took part in a half marathon, I wasn't running a marathon and then gave up halfway. Although I'll talk about that in a moment. I just trained for a 13-mile race. It was the first one I've ever done. And I remember when I was running, you hit a certain point where what happens is that you feel like giving up. It feels really tiring. And in fact, this is a very common phenomena. So in marathon races or those kind of endurance things, even in a half marathon, I noticed that there were people who were giving up. They'd get to about 9 or 10 miles and they'd stop and they'd shake their head. They'd had enough. And this is common in marathon running as well, that people give up fatigued. And yet in studies that have been done where those people who give up fatigued have their muscles checked to see if there is actually still a store of energy in there, if their muscles were actually capable of carrying on, they invariably find that, they were capable of carrying on. And yet, despite being capable of carrying on and completing the race, they've given up, claiming that their bodies had hit their limit. And it reminds me actually of a past client that I had who was an endurance athlete who made the point to me that your mind always wants to pack in long before your body is really ready to. And so this is interesting, isn't it? Like, why on earth would the mind try to persuade the body that it's had enough when objective tests show that it actually hasn't had enough and it's more than capable of completing the race? Well, evolutionarily, there's a really good reason not to spend all of your energy. Now imagine if you spend all of your energy to get to the finish line and sat waiting for you as a very hungry grizzly bear. Now you can see there that it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend all of your energy to get to the finish line when you don't know what's at the finish line. And so instead we fatigue and give up. In fact, fatigue can actually be viewed as a psychological defense against you spending all of your resources. Because from an evolutionary perspective, going back, say, 50,000 years, that wasn't actually a good idea to do, to spend all of your resources, because you might well need some of them at any time should a predator show up. So how do we actually get past this? Because, of course, nowadays, that's not likely to happen. We're not likely to get to the end of the marathon and find a hungry grizzly bear. We live in a safer time than, say, 50,000 years ago. Now, one way that we get past this, and that sports coaches use, athletics coaches use, in order to get past this problem where the mind tries to give up and persuade the body that it's too fatigued to carry on, even when the body has resources left, is something known as interval training, which you've probably heard of. So an example of interval training might be that the athlete would sprint for a very short amount of time and then relax back into an ordinary jog for a short while. And then they'd sprint for a short time and then come back into a jog. And so they'd be moving between these two states of really running at high intensity and then just relaxing back into a jog and then back again. Now, it might seem that what you're doing here is training the body, but what studies have shown is that what's actually happening here is that they're training the mind. And what it's doing there, it's not working on the body to help you go further and faster, but it's retraining the mind about what you can safely tolerate. So that previous idea that the mind had that you were too fatigued to carry on, this interval training basically retrains the mind that you can tolerate more. In other words, the brain has been showing fatigue too soon because it's having a prediction error about how much danger you might be in your environment, because these systems were learned a long, long time ago when there was far more danger in our environment than there is now. And so these days, it's not going to be that there's a hungry bear or a leopard or whatever at the end of the marathon. And so what all this shows is three things, really, that I'd like to go through with you. Because first of all, we can see that the mind makes false predictions based on old data. Secondly, we can see that what those predictions seem to be biased towards is limiting us, because it wants to conserve our resources. It wants to keep us safer than these days we need to be. And thirdly, we can see that interval training is something that happens for the mind in order to retrain those predictions. So let's take each of those in turn. So the first one is the mind makes false predictions. Now, we've looked at how it's making false predictions about our level of safety and how that's based on the fact that they were formed thousands of years ago. And so evolutionarily speaking, the brain, the mind, the nervous system, it's all operating on the basis of, well, there could be a grizzly bear here, there could be a leopard, there could be a saber-toothed tiger. And so it inclines towards keeping hold of some of our resources. But this happens in terms of our own history too. Let's say you grew up in an environment, for instance, where, there might have been a problem. There might have been somebody in the home, for instance, that was violent, and you were too small to try and solve that problem. Or it might be, for instance, that there was somebody scary, I don't know, maybe a parent or whatever, who would shout at you or criticize you if you were to be more visible. And so every time that you kind of, I don't know, sang a song or argued back or whatever, it became unsafe to do that, and you were either criticised or hit or whatever. Now, if you grew up in that environment, then still now today, even though you're not in that environment anymore, your mind will still be making predictions and your nervous system will be making predictions based on that old data as well. And so in the same way, we can see that the mind makes false predictions. Now, the second point you made there is that those predictions tend towards limiting us. So in the marathon example, it limits us in order to conserve our energy, to keep us safer. But in the example I've just given in terms of that kind of childhood, those predictions tend towards limiting us in a different way in order to keep us safe. It might say to us, for instance, you can't solve problems. When a problem arises, it's not safe for you to even try to solve the problem. Because when you tried when you were younger, it was just too dangerous. And so it's too dangerous now. And this actually is where things like depression can kick in, that sense of hopelessness, because our mind is telling us, based on this false prediction, based on how it used to be, that in fact it's not safe to solve problems. And of course, if we're not solving problems, then we quickly become overwhelmed. If we're not solving problems, then we're in a state of helplessness and a state of hopelessness. And so we tend to shut down into depression with little that we think that we can do, that we believe that we can do in order to change our circumstances. Now, the third point, though, is that what's been shown in terms of athletics and sports training is that interval training can actually retrain those predictions of the mind. Interval training can get the body to go faster and further, because what it's actually doing is it's retraining that old prediction from, say, 50,000 years ago. So what would happen if we used interval training more widely? What if we could use that same principle in order to use interval training to retrain the false predictions, not from 50,000 years ago, but the predictions that our brains are still working on from our own childhoods? Now, one of the things that I've spoken of before, which kind of fits this mold, is that sense of solving small problems. And so when we solve small problems, what it does is it retrains the idea of the brain, which is that we can't solve our problems because it's too dangerous. And so if you start finding small problems to solve, it acts very similar to interval training. And the problems need to be small enough that you can definitely do them, because what you're doing here is you're telling your brain, look, here's a problem and I'm solving it. And I did it successfully and nothing bad happened. It's doing the same thing as interval training is doing in order to show the mind that you can actually tolerate much more than it thinks you can. And so if it thinks that you can't solve problems because it's dangerous for you to do that, by solving these small problems, you can get the brain to notice that you're solving problems successfully and without negative consequence. Now, it's important to go with small problems because, first of all, the point is to show the mind that you're doing this successfully, to change its prediction that you can't solve problems by showing it, look, here we go, I can. But secondly, because we want to do this repeatedly, much like interval training works, small problems are in abundance. They're all around us, aren't they? That bin is full and needs emptying, for instance. This counter's got a splash on it. Whatever it happens to be, that dish needs washing. There's all sorts of these kind of small problems that need to be fixed. Now, if we consciously and intentionally solve these problems and emphasize that we've solved problems, maybe like putting it in a journal, if we start to notice every incremental improvement in our life, that if we hadn't have done it, would make life worse in some way. We make our bed, for instance, or we take our vitamin tablets, or we go for a walk. All these little victories are ways in which we can use that interval training mechanism in order to retrain the false limiting predictions of our brain. Now, in this case, I'm talking about that sense of helplessness and hopelessness that comes along with a mind prediction, a nervous system prediction, that problems are too unsafe for us to even try to solve. And so in that case, we're going against it in a very small but deliberate and repeated way, and emphasizing the victory on each occasion. So we can basically say to the mind, look, you got your prediction wrong because I've just solved a problem and I was successful and there was no negative consequence. In fact, life's just got better. And so just like the marathon runner using interval training to get further and faster, to retrain the body that, in fact, we don't have to limit ourselves here. We can do the same as well in terms of our emotional well-being, in terms of our capabilities to change our world, our mood, and the environment around us, so that in the same way we can train our own minds, just like interval training does, that its initial prediction was false, that it was too conservative, and that we have a lot more potential than our brain and our mind and our nervous systems initially predicted. If you found this episode useful, please do share it so other people can get the benefits as well. If you'd like to work with me directly, I'm Alun Parry, and you can find more about me at liverpoolpsychotherapy.co.uk. And of course, you don't have to be local to me because I work online, so you can be based absolutely anywhere. And of course, please subscribe to the podcast as well, because it's absolutely free and it means that you'll never miss an episode again. So thanks for listening, and I'll see you again on the next one.